Starting off, I wanted to mention that I kind of picked this topic for the only reason that I was really interested in it right now. Honestly, this topic doesn't directly connect to any current activism we're a part of. And I hope to encourage comrades, especially newer members, that when you're looking to do a kickoff, it's okay to start with something that interests you and then work backwards to find the Marxist vein within it. I love that Jim did a talk on Andor because that's interesting to him. And we really do mean it when we say that Marxism can fuel any mode of resistance. I do think that the topics covered here are necessarily directly useful and engaging in social movements or leading a revolution. In fact, I'd say that an overemphasis on them would probably hinder revolutionary efforts. Before I jump into a bunch of philosophic stuff, I want to give a quick definition of dialectical materialism. Yes, yes, the magic wand of socialists, which you use to wave away any naysayers or doubters, anybody who might doubt our Lord and Savior, Lenin. No, but for real, although it's frequently abused, the concepts the term presents are indispensable for fully grasping the Marxist tool set. In fact, we could say that it's the very foundation. To quote Engels on dialectics from the introduction of Anti-Düring, when Engels says, when we consider and reflect upon nature at large or the history of mankind or our own intellectual activity, at first we see the picture of an endless entanglement of relations and reactions in which nothing remains what, where, and as it was, but everything moves, changes, comes into being, and passes away. This primitive, naive, but intrinsically correct conception of the world is that of ancient Greek philosophy and was first clearly formulated by Heraclitus. Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, is constantly changing, constantly coming into being and passing away. The application of this philosophic understanding to the material world is the real meat. Materialism holds that the material world exists independent of our minds. Matter precedes our minds, and our ideas are a product of it and shaped by it. Matter can exist without the mind, but mind cannot exist without matter. We can achieve limited but real knowledge of the material world in practice. This means the means by which we go about achieving this limited knowledge is by applying a dialectical understanding to the corporeal world and seeing what comes out. This practice results in what we know as the philosophy of praxis, that we must interact with the ever-changing nature of reality in order to understand it. As Marx's most famous quote goes, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. We understand the material world and its changing nature. How well we as Marxist activists are able to utilize this methodology of dialectical materialism will determine how successful we will be at changing the world. Typically speaking, the methodology of Marxism is a tool restricted to the social sphere and excluded from the natural sphere. The environment, nature, corporeal bodies, genetics, physical, organic reality have been mistakenly assumed to be outside of Marxism. Even within the Denver Communists, the amount of talks focused on ecology and nature are pretty sparse. I counted 2 that we have in our catalog. I don't mean this as a criticism, just as an observation. One of those talks is from Jim on environmental Leninism, and it's great. I encourage everyone to go back and check that out. We largely see Marxism as more applicable to society, the fight against racism, exploitation of classes, women's liberation, social reproduction, and the analysis of markets and other stuff. I think the mistake operates on 2 levels. One is that it assumes a false dualism between nature and society, as if civilization has become separated from the cycles and rhythms of nature, and we exist as something wholly apart from its genesis as well as its demise. Climate change has a little something to say about that. The second is that after this false duality was established, we relegated Marx to the social. While it is true that Marxism finds a multitude of application all throughout society, it would be criminal to not study and understand the methodology's lasting impact on environmental analysis. According to Marx's own conception, this duality did not exist. He understood humanity to be both part of nature and also a force of nature. I need to first explain what is meant by metabolism. More than I'm going to use a lot. The chemist Justus von Liebig first used metabolism in referring to material exchanges in the body up to the biochemical processes of natural systems, and his analysis of soil nutrition depletion. Conceptually, we can understand our own body's cycles of resources, eating and pooping, applied to the nutritious health of soil. Darwin then expands his observation of soil vertically to Earth systems more generally by introducing universal metabolism, the same kind of material exchanges in the body, but now applied to entire ecosystems and the Earth system at large. Marx builds on universal metabolism with his analysis of the capitalist mode of production by introducing the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. Building on both Liebig and Darwin, Marx asserts that the depletion of soil nutrients is not a merely localized problem, but is relevant to the whole Earth system, universal metabolism, through a globalized imperial mode of production, what we know as capitalism. John Bellamy Foster calls this formulation metabolic rift to describe the ways that the universal metabolism of Earth have been snapped by capitalist production. When Karl Marx was initially formulating Marxism, his work came alongside that of Charles Darwin. Given that Capital was published about 8 years after Origin of Species and that both Darwin and Marx were primarily working out of London, we can assume that they were at the very least familiar with each other's work, if not only by proximity. While the word ecology was first used in 1866, it wasn't a common term until the early 20th century. Metabolism was the more common term to refer to what we now know as ecology or environmental analysis of any kind. Theoretically, Darwin and Marx are accessing the same question of environmental economy from two different angles. Darwin is taking the universal metabolism of Earth systems and applying economic analysis to better understand the function of its structures, while Marx is taking the political economy of scientific socialism, what we see as class, wage labor, perpetual expansion, competition, primitive accumulation, and applying it to the natural world. The universal metabolism that Darwin and others establish is transformed through Marx as social metabolism, the capitalistic rupture of universal metabolism. This is the idea that there exists a universal metabolism outside of the force of humanity that has been broken by the capitalist mode of production, the irreparable rift in the interdependent processes of social metabolism. Again, Marx uses the work of Liebig and soil nutrition to make this point as he witnessed the rise of mass importing of bones and guano as chemical fertilizers to the ravaged soils in England. Another example has to do with the removal of the wolf population in Yellowstone National Park that completely destabilized the ecosystem until the wolves were reintroduced. The only difference being that we have reached a point where now we can't simply put things back in the way they were and everything goes back to being healthy. Addressing this metabolic rift isn't merely for the sake of financial gain. Marx doesn't advocate for an egalitarian redistribution of private property so all may live in this luxury. The materialism Marx champions sets its goal as a fundamentally restructured reality, a dynamic that sets to unmake the alienation of nature under capitalism is such that money is fetishistically mistaken for existence, while private extraction and expropriation, the robbery of the earth, is confused for real wealth, a dialectics of liberation. The question is then, how does Marx become divorced from this original tradition of ecology, becomes restricted to humanities as severed from natural history? There are two answers to this question. The first is that of the official Marxism of the Soviet Union, removed the critical aspect of Marx's ecology in the late 1930s. Yeah, we're talking about Stalin. For most of the international left, the USSR constituted the definitive progression of the tradition of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And obviously, they exclude Trotsky from that. As we see in other ways, ecology as we see in other ways as well, ecology was subjected to a Stalinization that muted the dialectical critical character in favor of dialectical laws that weren't dialectical at all. Previous to the publication of Stalin's rigid and dogmatic dialectical and historical materialism marked the definitive end of debate, there is a struggle between two philosophic sides within the early Bolshevik state. The dialectically inclined Debornist looked to uphold the Hegelian idealism as critically mediated by the materialist tradition of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and that of the mechanistic leaning who were more closely tied to the natural sciences, Bukharin and Plekhanov. Not that they were opposed to critical analysis, but they held more mechanistic tendencies. Initially, the Debornists went out through political means, being more closely tied to the Bolshevik state, but the philosophic debate remained unresolved as they were essentially arguing between positive natural science and dialectical philosophy, two disciplines that shouldn't really be opposed to one another in the first place. Of course, all of these thinkers are purged in the mid-30s along with any opposition, critical thought, or deviation from Stalin. Ricardo himself is executed in 1938. What pervades as the official Soviet dialectical materialism is a crude and mechanistic monism, claiming an adherence to natural science, but only that which served the political needs of the state. On the other side of the coin, we have the Western Marxist tradition that follows a different course. In this tradition, the dialectics of nature was claimed invalid due to dialectics requiring an identical subject-object in order to be applied. Natural history could not, as they claimed, be dialectical because the natural world is by definition external to the subject-object of humanity. Society is created by humanity, therefore a unified subject-object and applicable. Nature, unlike society, precludes society and thus is not the unified subject-object of dialectics. Not only does this separate Marxism from ecology, but also denaturalizes Marx's materialism to mere political economic relations, not material, and understands the materialism of nature to be purely mechanistic or vitalist. The understanding of the division between dialectical and materialism that Perry Anderson was able to publish in 1967, claiming that no major figure in the third generation of classical Marxism was affected by developments in the physical science, and later even said that problems of the interaction of the human species with its terrestrial environment essentially absent from classical Marxism. Treating Marx's ecological critique as completely non-existent. To review, environmental analysis through metabolism was the core basis of Marx's political economy, absolutely indispensable to understanding his methodology. With the official Soviet dialectical materialism being divorced from dialectics and the Western Marxist tradition being totally divorced from materialism, we can now begin to understand more succinctly how contemporary Marxist activists have found ourselves estranged from the real tradition of Marxism. The correcting of these deviations is essential to developing a strategy that can progress towards eco-socialism and combating climate change and saving our planet. We must bug the question that David Camfield puts forward in his interview of what kind of struggles are needed in order to win a radical Green New Deal. Inherent in his question is not a static notion of what are the reforms necessary in order to pass, or the reforms necessary to pass in order to stop climate change. That doesn't work. It isn't which campaign should we be donating to stop fracking. That also doesn't work. Nor which progressive candidate should we be voting for. That too doesn't work. What does work is orienting ourselves to the point of generation of metabolic rift, the engagement with struggles against the capitalist mode of production. Camfield continues by again citing the dialectical method. More important than the demands of themselves are the methods of action that people engage in order to achieve them. It's through the process of mass struggle that people change, that we develop our own capacities and build new forms of organization. We might build the power needed to actually win something. Our organizational efforts must be focused less on the aims we're headed towards and then on the dynamics we're accessing in order to achieve those aims. The ecology of Marx via dialectical materialism uncovers the culprit of perpetual crisis as the capitalist mode of production. Not a single capitalist, fossil fuel industry, or plastic straws or lithium batteries, but the capitalist mode of production. This analysis provides the only fertile ground from which we can develop a strategy for effective progress towards socialism and a mode of production that can save our planet. Anything short of this, either the idealistic dialectics of Western Marxism or the rigidly mechanistic materialism of the former Soviet Union will be able to correctly diagnose the problem. Until we're able to adopt this analysis into a coherent strategy, capitalism will continue to accumulate for accumulation's sake, produce for production's sake, and destroy anything in its path for profit's sake. It is truly the runaway train, the zombie virus, and the opened Pandora's box. The solution cannot be a nicer, greener capitalism, but the total abolition of capitalism and its mean of production that alienate us from ourselves and the natural world. We must heed Rosa Luxemburg's words, for truly it is socialism or barbarism.